Bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis, this is Tax Credit Tuesday. Sitting in today for Michael Novogradac, here's your host, Tony Grappone.
Hello, I'm Tony Grappone, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the March 3rd, 2026 episode. Welcome to the latest episode in our Renewable Energy Tax Credit Finance series. I'm usually the featured guest on this series, but today I'm stepping in as the host. And I'm thrilled to introduce our special guest, my partner, Josh Morris. In this episode, we will focus on the Foreign Entity of Concern, aka FEOC rules. The OBBBA, which was signed into law on July 4th, 2025, introduced comprehensive FEOC restrictions in order to qualify for clean energy tax credits, such as the tax credits provided for under Internal Revenue Code sections 45Y, 48E, and these are the sections that cover the tax credits for technologies like wind, solar, battery storage, and many other clean energy technologies, as well as the advanced manufacturing credit under 45X. These new FEOC rules have been codified by the Internal Revenue Code in sections 7701A51 and 770152. 7701A51 lays out the framework that defines prohibited foreign entities, which can mean either a specified foreign entity or a foreign influenced entity. Section 7701A52 introduces the concept of material assistance from prohibited foreign entities, or PFEs. On February 12, 2026, the Treasury Department issued IRS Notice 26-15, or I should say 2026-15, but I'll refer to it throughout the podcast simply as 26-15, which provides interim guidance regarding the calculation of the Material Assistance Cost Ratio, or MACR. Josh, do you say MACR or do you say MACR?
I say maker, but I've heard people call it MACR.
Okay.
I think either one works.
Would you call it OB cubed or OB3?
I call it OB3.
I do too. Okay, so Notice 26-15 provides interim guidance regarding the calculation of the Material Assistance Cost Ratio, or MACR. The interim guidance sheds new light on how to calculate the Material Assistance Cost Ratio with and without using the optional safe harbors. And while the notice doesn't resolve all interpretive, documentation, and enforcement questions raised by the statute, it is viewed as very helpful in order for financing parties to move forward with underwriting tax credit eligibility. In today's episode, though, we will focus on moving beyond IRS Notice 2026-15 and focus on strategic implications, underwriting impacts, and practical implementation questions that financing parties are asking. Now, obviously, understanding the full complexities of FEOC would take substantially more time than we have available during today's podcast. I will note, however, that Josh Morris is the lead author of Novogradac's recently published special report on the FEOC regime, which is a comprehensive guide to PFE compliance, material assistance, and material assistance cost ratio implementation for clean energy tax credits. The firm's Associate Director of Public Policy, Julia Dinkle, contributed to the report with policy review. Now, the special report is 85 pages. I'm not even done reading the whole entire thing. It came out last week. It's excellent. I was reading some other book. I had to put that down. I'm now reading the Novogradac's Guide to the FEOC Regime. It's extremely well written. It's easy to follow, all kinds of great insights in there. And I'm sure we'll touch on that report later. But that's not the point of today's episode. Today's podcast is to, as I said, get into more strategic implementation of the guidance that we have at this stage of the game. And I can't think of anyone better to have this conversation with than my partner, Josh Morris, who has been at the forefront of all things FEOC. So as we like to say on this podcast, if you're ready, let's get started. Josh, welcome to the podcast, and please take a moment to introduce yourself and let the listeners know what services you offer with respect to FEOC.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I appreciate you including me on the podcast. And for those that don't know me, I'm a partner at Novogradac, and I'm based in Ohio. I spend most of my time working with developers, investors, lenders, and manufacturers on the tax and accounting side of renewable energy projects, especially around tax credit structuring and monetization. On the FEOC front, specifically, I'm doing a lot of work helping manufacturers think through their PFE status, think ownership, control, debt tests, and we provide agreed upon procedure reports to help them document that analysis. On the project side, we're helping sponsors and investors with MACR calculations, safe harbor versus the direct cost strategy, and building defensible reason to know diligence packages. So really, my role sits at the intersection of compliance and capital and helping clients make sure that what they're documenting is actually financeable.
Excellent. And so in your response, you touched on services that you provide for manufacturers. And then you also talked about services that you provide to the project owners. So, developers, right? And
Right.
you have some experience here, right? You've been doing this. You've been providing manufacturers with similar types of services for domestic content. Same thing with project developers, right? So are you kind of leveraging a bit of what you did with domestic content and finding opportunities to expand what you did in domestic content to build that out to provide solutions for FEOC compliance as well?
Definitely. It's a similar playbook, and a lot of those relationships and supply chain mapping strategies that were used for domestic content, they're very much applicable for FEOC. And so once FEOC came out, I was getting all the phone calls from those same manufacturers and projects that we were doing domestic content work with, and they were immediately thinking, okay, we don't know all the rules yet for FEOC, but we're going to have to utilize Novogradac to help with this same type of process, but with a slightly different subject matter. A lot of overlapping issues happening between domestic content and FEOC, but they are independently different. You do need to do different types of tasks. If you satisfy domestic content, it doesn't mean you're going to satisfy FEOC. And so you have to dig in on each set of facts.
Great. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. For folks that are new to FEOC, that's a common misunderstanding that some people have, is that they assume that, oh, if I qualify for domestic content, well, I should automatically qualify for FEOC. Not necessarily the case. You might be buying components from a supplier or manufacturer where the manufacturer is happening right here in the United States. However, that manufacturer might actually be a prohibited foreign entity at the end of the day. So simply qualifying for domestic content doesn't necessarily guarantee compliance with FEOC. But I love the fact that you, as your starting point of building your service playbook for FEOC, you were able to leverage what was done in domestic content. And the reason why I think that's so valuable is because those project level services and those manufacturer level services that you develop for domestic content, you figured out that they worked for financing parties.
And that took a long time to set up and establish the relationships with manufacturers. When we were first doing that with domestic content, those manufacturers were uneasy. It was new to them to be thrown into this tax equity space, if you will. And now they get it. They understand the importance of providing documentation and answering the sponsors' questions. And so that will make FEOC due diligence a lot easier. If we were tackling FEOC without ever having dealt with domestic content, it would be that long. It took a year or a year and a half, I would say, before there was a really solid domestic content playbook. Now, FEOC is complicated and different, but we're starting on a whole different plane here because of all of the work done with domestic content. So it's good.
Yeah, in the form of the engagement, like the form of the deliverable at least has already been tested and accepted, and it's gained comfort in the marketplace. So that's great to know that there was at least some similarities there, or there was some kind of deliverable to leverage moving forward. Okay, wonderful. Now, Josh, in your view, how has Notice 26-15 helped make FEOC quote unquote bankable?
Yeah. So I think the mature way to think about this is not whether Treasury answered every open issue, because it clearly did not do that by design, but whether they moved FEOC from something abstract and policy driven into something operational and underwritable. And in my view, I think they did. Before this notice, FEOC felt like an open-ended structural issue. Investors couldn't model it. They couldn't diligence it in a consistent way. And frankly, didn't know what a defensible compliance package might even look like. And that's what froze the market. But what this guidance did was fully operationalize the MACR framework. We now have defined identification safe harbor tables, cost percentage safe harbor tables, and a certification regime that allows developers, tax equity investors, and transferability buyers to assemble something, tangible, a compliance file that can be reviewed, can be questioned, and ultimately underwritten. Now, it doesn't mean uncertainty is gone entirely. The PFE criteria guidance, it's absolutely critical. Effective control issues, the 15% debt threshold, indirect ownership structures, anti-circumvention, the list goes on and on, recapture tied to fraudulent certifications. All of those issues go to that threshold question, whether someone is even a PFE in the first place. But capital markets can function with defined compliance risk, and they struggle with undefined risk. So this notice shifts FEOC from undefined to defined, and that's why I do think it materially advances bankability.
I like the way you phrase that. So yeah, definitely. Still obviously more wood to chop on the guidance front with several topics, but just in terms of the material assistance cost ratio calculation, the notice certainly seemed to help operationalize that analysis and should,
Right.
with respect to that aspect of the diligence, help parties be able to move forward with a bit more confidence. Okay, so based on where we're at, who do you feel now has a structural advantage under this new guidance?
Sure. What I'm seeing is that it isn't primarily about technology, it's about readiness. Developers who already built, like we said, that domestic content, compliance infrastructure, they have a real head start. They've mapped their supply chains. They've built processes for collecting supplier attestations. They've already had the hard conversations about sourcing and ownership transparency. And for them, FEOC will be an extension of that existing compliance discipline. They can tackle domestic content and FEOC in parallel, which is operationally efficient. And then on the other hand, where things get more complicated, it's for technologies without safe harbor tables, right? Think nuclear, geothermal, RNG, fuel cell projects. They don't have the same identification safe harbor that defines the MPs and MPCs. They don't have cost percentage safe harbors that simplify the math. That pushes them towards that direct cost substantiation, which is inherently more bespoke and documentation heavy. And then also projects with opaque, multi-tiered supply chains, they're going to really feel friction. If you can't clearly identify who manufactured your MPCs, building reliance on those certifications will become extremely difficult.
Excellent. Great. So you touched on some of the technologies that safe harbor tables don't exist for. Can you just quickly remind listeners which technologies we have safe harbor tables for at this juncture?
Solar, wind, and battery. We've got tables for those three technologies, and they're clear winners here. And if you're one of those technologies that also is used to the domestic content cadence, then you're even further ahead.
Great. So if you're not wind, solar, or battery technologies, right, you can obviously still meet the material assistance cost ratio, but you're forced to do it not under the safe harbor approach, but you're doing direct cost tracing, right?
That's right. That's right. And hoping that safe harbor tables will come out soon for your technology to make your life a little bit easier.
Indeed. Awesome. All right. I know you talk to a lot of developers and financing parties and as well as manufacturers. From what you can tell, what operational infrastructure do you think developers need at this stage?
Sure, for developers, I'd encourage them to think about this as building a repeatable compliance system, not solving for one transaction. Step one is granular supply chain mapping down to the MP and MPC level, reflected in the safe harbor tables. That goes beyond knowing your tier one vendor. You shouldn't just stop at, say, the module manufacturer, but you need to know who actually manufactures the components that drive your cost percentage. And so think the cell level, the junction box, the frames for the module. Then when you're thinking about the inverter, you need to know who actually makes the printed circuit board assemblies, not just the inverter itself. Once you've mapped that, then step two is assessing PFE exposure at that MP and MPC level. With that visibility, you can make a strategic choice. Am I doing the safe harbor route or am I doing the direct cost approach? Then once you make that decision, and I'll say most projects, they're going to want to go the safe harbor route, right? That's going to be more efficient. And the key strategic insight is that you don't need to document every component. You just need to exceed the threshold. So the practical strategy would be to identify which MPCs get you across the line and focus certification and due diligence efforts there. But then the next step, once you've determined if you're going the safe harbor or the direct cost route, you need to obtain those certifications. And the certifications, they're not going to be enough. You must build internal workflows that document your reason to know diligence. You need to perform red flag screenings, get questionnaires answered with your suppliers, have targeted follow-up on material cost drivers. And overall, the real friction point in the real-world application will be that interface with the manufacturers. Ownership transparency and upstream sourcing detail, that's where the operational maturity will matter the most.
Excellent. A lot of great comments there. Thank you. All right. I know there's been a lot of discussion with respect to the ability of project owners to rely on certifications. You were just talking about certifications a few moments ago, so sticking with that theme here. So the ability of project owners to rely on certifications from manufacturers and suppliers. How do you think the market should think about certification risk?
The risk is layered, and it's important not to oversimplify it. Manufacturers, they have to certify under penalties of perjury. That's serious exposure. They must deeply understand their ownership structure, upstream MPC sourcing, and PFE status. But the certification safe harbor doesn't just eliminate downstream responsibility. Developers, investors, they must independently satisfy the reason to know standard. And the way I frame this, it's through a tiered diligence model. Tier 1 is the certification itself. You have to get the cert, right? And then once you have the cert, Tier 2 is corroboration. You need to get those supplier questionnaires, high-level supply chain mapping, red flag screening. And then Tier 3, you might not need to do this for every situation, but you need to do a targeted, deeper diligence for major cost drivers or higher risk exposure areas. I expect as we go, market norms will start to coalesce around something like that framework over time.
Great. Excellent. All right. So the release of IRS Notice 2026-15, since then, it's been very helpful, especially in terms of calculating the material assistance cost ratio. When it comes to clarity that's still needed, what matters most in the next tranche of guidance with respect to material assistance?
Yeah, I feel like they definitely hit material assistance pretty hard. That notice was quite comprehensive, but I think there are still two central issues that do need to resolve. We talked about it a little bit already, but first they need to expand the safe harbor tables. Entire sectors, they're waiting for definitional clarity around what manufactured product components might be, what level to go to. And then secondly, the reason to know standard, right? Particularly in good faith scenarios. So if a project conducts robust diligence and still could not have known that the certification was false, what happens then for, say, ITC recapture? Who bears those consequences? So that question is really going to drive investor behavior, and I'll be interested to see if any type of good faith safe harbor might come into place.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Perfect. Thanks. All right. Now I'd like to turn our attention to what I'd like to refer to as rapid fire questions, where I'll ask a series of brief questions for you to respond to with respect to what you're hearing in the marketplace. Okay, so now we'll start with questions that are geared towards developers. Then after that, we'll pivot to questions related more towards manufacturers. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with questions specific to investors. So starting with developers, for the safe harbor approach, do I have to trace components deeper than the MPC level?
It's a good question. And I know this is the rapid fire section and I'm meant to be quick, but I'm going to give you a long-winded answer. But the short answer is no. Okay. The short answer is no. But the long answer is that, under the identification safe harbor, the tracing stops at the MP and MPC level defined in the tables. You don't trace into the constituent materials unless you elect the direct cost approach. Okay. And that distinction is extremely important. Safe harbor was intentionally designed to avoid the burden of tracing raw materials. Instead, you're working from an exclusive list of MPCs with predetermined cost percentage values. The manufacturer certification under safe harbor is binary at the MPC level. Is this MPC manufactured by a PFE or not? If the MPC is manufactured by a non-PFE, you count the full percentage points from the table. If the MPC is manufactured by a PFE, you count 0, even if some of the underlying raw materials are made by non-PFEs. Now, this is where I expect manufacturers will need to issue different types of certifications depending on whether the project is pursuing the safe harbor or the direct costs. Under a safe harbor cert, essentially the manufacturer needs to identify this MPC is manufactured by a PFE or this MPC is not manufactured by a PFE. Pretty simple, right? Then under the direct cost approach, the certification becomes more granular. Let's say the solar cell is manufactured by a PFE. Under the safe harbor approach, right, that's 0 points, end of story. But under the direct cost approach, you have optionality. If some percentage of the raw materials or subcomponents are made by non-PFEs, you could potentially include the non-PFE portion in your MACR calculation. So to do that, though, you would need the manufacturer to certify the percentage of its direct costs attributable to non-PFEs. Then you apply that percentage to the amount you paid for in the example we were using, the module. So, direct costs is more complicated, but it can provide flexibility where the safe harbor MACR doesn't compute.
Fascinating. So earlier you talked about just the inherent efficiencies of using the safe harbor, right? But now you revealed how in certain situations, maybe the direct cost tracing, there's a place for that to provide some benefits not necessarily offered by the safe harbor. Interesting. Okay.
I think over time, as the manufacturers become sophisticated here and sponsors develop their strategies, where right now I don't see anybody even considering the direct cost approach, I could see an evolution where you could get to the point where you do the safe harbor calc, you run the math there, and you're not going to hit the ratio. You're not going to hit the threshold. But if you actually do a deeper dig into your cost profile, you might conclude, hey, those default percentages in the safe harbor table, they actually aren't commensurate with the cost breakdown of my project. And once I actually know the PFE, non-PFE status of raw materials within the MPCs, I might actually be better off doing the direct cost approach. Now, that means that every layer of that supply chain is sophisticated enough to be able to give you accurate results. That requires intimate research and understanding of the component level. And that's why I think most folks are just not even thinking about that approach. But maybe a year and a half from now, we might see more of a focus on the direct cost approach when it makes sense.
I could definitely see a manufacturer that knows that there are maybe a meaningful amount of raw materials that are coming from non-PFEs. And they're thinking, geez, if I don't get a firm to help us prove the significance of our non-PFE raw materials, I might be losing out to other manufacturers because, maybe the developer just wants to hire a manufacturer that's, 0 non-PFE raw materials in their component supply chain. And so I could see manufacturers wanting to reach out to say, look, we think we actually have a pretty strong non-PFE profile overall with our components, and we want to work with somebody like us to help figure that out so they can use that to market their products. Okay, so if I obtain a manufacturer's certificate, is that enough, or do you think I have to do more?
Sure. So obviously a certification, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient on its own. So you must also satisfy, we keep saying it, the reason to know standard. And what we're seeing in the market is that manufacturers, they're providing very different types of PFE packages, right? Some are very robust. They provide ownership charts, upstream supplier summaries, explanations of control analysis. Others are extremely thin. They might be 2 pages and they literally just say, we're not a PFE, and that's that. So projects, they can't just accept those packages blindly. And what we've been doing with clients is what I call a FEOC scorecard. So the project shares the various manufacturer packages with us, and we help the developer create an objective scoring rubric based on the criteria that matter most to that sponsor. Do they care about ownership transparency, upstream diligence, documentation completeness? What all did they care about for their risk profile? We then score the packages provided into defined tiers that helps determine whether additional follow-up is required. So obtaining the certification, it should be a back and forth process, not one-way transmission. Okay, I got your cert. Now I'm going to do my MACR calc. If something's unclear, you should ask. And if something is incomplete, you should request supplementation. So that documented dialogue becomes part of your reason to know file.
Excellent. Well said. All right. How is the FEOC direct cost calculation different from the domestic content direct cost calculation?
Yep. Structurally, they look similar, but they're not exactly identical. So for domestic content, the direct cost ratio is based on manufacturer's direct costs. And that often requires third-party involvement to obtain actual cost breakdown from the manufacturer. Now for FEOC, the maker is calculated based on the taxpayer's direct costs of the applicable project component, what the project actually paid. And so that makes information gathering less restrictive. From the project's perspective, you don't need to obtain the manufacturer's exact cost accounting records. However, you do need the manufacturer to certify the percentage of the applicable project component attributable to non-PFEs. So it definitely feels easier for the project, and in many ways it is, but it places significant diligence pressure on the manufacturer. They must understand the PFE status of their upstream inputs in order to provide accurate percentage certification. So it's easier for the project, but it's shifting the burden upstream.
Okay, interesting. Thanks. If I choose safe harbor, do I still need to understand my full supply chain?
Yes, as we keep mentioning, you can't blindly rely on the manufacturer cert, right? You need to understand who the MPC manufacturer actually is. If you're buying from a distributor, you need clarity on who manufactured the MPC and what that party did to substantiate the PFE status. These supply chains, there's multiple layers. It might take a few layers before you even get to the manufacturer of the MPC. So you don't need every bolt mapped, but you at least need visibility down to that MP and MPC level with enough understanding that the certification aligns with the procurement reality. And again, trust but verify, right?
Okay, that kind of wraps up our developer rapid fire questions. I'm going to move on. I got a couple of manufacturer questions. First off, should certifications be issued now or wait for final guidance?
I promise I'll go faster on these rapid fire questions. I think I lingered too
good.
much on the developer ones.
You're good. You're providing a lot of great insights here, and I know our listeners appreciate it.
Yep. And so for manufacturers, should they issue the certs now or wait? They're under real pressure to issue the certs now. Developers want them, investors want them, but I would strongly encourage manufacturers to first fully understand the PFE criteria and their upstream MPC manufacturers before issuing their certs. Also, think strategically, developers and distributors, they're going to build those internal scorecards, right? And incomplete certification issued quickly might actually create short-term satisfaction, but long-term friction. So I think manufacturers that deliver thoughtful, well-documented packages, they're more likely to land in favorable tiers within sponsor and distributor scorecards. Speed without substance could actually hurt their positioning.
Great cautionary advice. All right, next question. How deep must upstream diligence go before signing under penalties of perjury?
Yeah, deep enough to be comfortable signing that cert under those penalties of perjury. That should mean understanding ownership structure, board control, debt relationships, upstream sourcing of the MPCs. And here's the nuance. If an APC manufacturer is relying on a cert from an upstream MPC manufacturer, they must satisfy their own reason to know standard with respect to those certs before issuing downstream certs. So that whole diligence obligation, it's a cascading effect. Every single level has to have a sober sophistication and approach to collecting the facts.
No doubt. All right, great. So moving on now, I've got a few investor questions. What does a defensible reason to know diligence file look like?
Yeah, the best files I've seen, they're not passive. They don't just attach the manufacturer package and call it a day. They show that the sponsor rolled up their sleeves, they reviewed the package, they asked follow-up questions, they documented the dialogue, they made reasoned judgments based on their risk appetite. Certifications, corroboration materials, red flag screening, and documented follow-up. You want to be able to tell a coherent story about why exactly you're comfortable. You didn't just get the cert and keep it moving.
Agreed. Makes sense. All right. Can investors rely on sponsor diligence?
They can start there, but investors, they might have a different risk profile, and they probably do. I would encourage investors to take the sponsor package and ask, if this were my reason to know checklist, would this satisfy it? And in many cases, they'll probably perform supplemental due diligence, and the sponsor shouldn't feel that that's distrust, but it's risk calibration, and investors might be more risk adverse.
No doubt. Yep. Good advice. All right. And how should residual FEOC risk be priced in the market?
Yeah, the stronger the sponsor's diligence package, the more efficient the pricing, I would say. If the sponsor has robust documentation, thoughtful analysis, limited unanswered questions, I'd expect tighter spreads, less friction. If they have open issues, then manufacturer packages, unresolved diligence gaps, pricing pressure will increase. Residual risk can be addressed through deeper diligence, contractual indemnities, insurance structures, or return adjustment, but clarity will reduce the friction.
Yep. Similar like we've seen in other tax credit compliance matters, right? Stronger diligence packages, easier to underwrite fact pattern, usually strengthens pricing, and the opposite can be said for weaker diligence profiles. Excellent. All good stuff. With that said, Josh, please summarize by offering a few key closing takeaways.
Yeah, so FEOC, it's no longer this abstract policy risk. It's a diligence exercise. The market now has a framework. What we're watching in real time is the formation of a new underwriting standard around certifications, reason to know, supply chain visibility. The participants who lean into that early, who build repeatable compliance systems and document their judgment, they'll see smoother execution and better pricing. This is how new compliance regimes mature. Uncertainty gives way to process, and process restores capital confidence.
Love it. Okay, super. Now, for listeners out there who want to learn more about FEOC, you can go to the Novogradac website, www.novoco.com, and you can go to our Tax Credit Resource Center, and there you can find a link to the firm's guide to FEOC regime that was authored by Josh. And if you can't find it there, just go to Josh's LinkedIn page. He posted about it late last week. You can go to my LinkedIn page. I reposted Josh's post about the FEOC guidebook. So, yep. And again, super helpful report, or just comprehensive understanding of all the FEOC matters. All right, Josh, thank you very much. This has been fantastic. For our audience members who have specific follow-up questions, I encourage you to reach out to Josh directly. You can email Josh at Josh, Josh, Morris, Morris, at novoco.com. That's novoco.com. And I'll include his contact information in today's show notes. I'd also encourage you to check out the rest of the firm's Renewable Energy Tax Credit Finance series at novoco.com/podcast or via Apple products, Spotify, and YouTube. On YouTube, we have a dedicated playlist for our Renewable Energy series episodes, which makes them easy to binge watch. And if there are other platforms where you think we should be, please let us know. And if you have ideas or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at cpas@novoco.com. That's cpas@novoco.com. I guarantee you we'll probably do some more. We'll do some future podcasts on FEOC, right? I already know what I'm going to do. When clients reach out to me and they have those initial questions on FEOC, I'm apt to say, look, go check out the podcast. That'll get you prepared. A lot of great information here. You touched on a lot of stuff during this podcast, Josh, that baits other questions. You talked about the red flag analysis. You talked about the inquiry forms, the Q&A stuff. I know clients are sitting there thinking, like, what questions? What red flag analysis? What should I be doing in my red flag analysis? What types of questions should I be asking my manufacturers? You provided a lot of
What are the categories for my scorecard? What categories am I,
Yes.
objectively scoring?
Yeah, and we don't determine the scores, but we help our clients. They determine the scores, but we can help them figure out how to get to those scores. But I know our clients are thinking, well, how do I know what the scores should be? And some of that's based off of feedback from financing counterparties where they've indicated which criteria is the most important to them and why, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, you've gone through so much stuff during today's episode, and I know that your comments help trigger additional questions from clients. And so they're hearing things and they're like, all right, I need to reach out to Josh. I need to ask him more about what he means by these specific things he touched on. So excellent episode. Now, if you're a frequent listener of this podcast, you know at the end we do what's called an off mic section, right? And so now let's turn to our off mic section. This is a fun segment where we can acknowledge our industry colleagues with shout outs. Josh, do you have a shout out for this episode?
I do. I want to give a shout out to the Crux team. I know Katie Bays over there really well, and her team, they put together a really comprehensive 2025 market study or market analysis. Very robust. There's over 100 pages, and it went through key stats and figures around project financings in the past year, and they surveyed a lot of their clientele about their projects and different parameters and things that were important. And then they also applied a forward-looking approach to what's ahead. I thought it was a really awesome analysis and really in-depth, and talked about a lot of the key things going on around us. The headwinds that we all faced in 2025, from political uncertainty, from regulatory uncertainty, FEOC issues, and interestingly enough, 2025 was a pretty good year. We all saw, despite the headwinds, increased volume in renewable energy production and finance deployment. And so their study was really revealing as to the resilience of the industry. And they talked about what's ahead with the data centers that are being built, the AI issues that are causing increased energy demand. And it was really well done. So I want to give the Crux team a big shout out for that resource that they put together.
Awesome. Thank you. I've seen Crux's market intel report. It is impressive, no doubt about it. So I too would like to thank Crux and the team. And Katie, you got a shout out. All right, Katie and the Crux team, congratulations on getting a Novogradac podcast shout out. And thank you for putting together that really insightful report. So it's fantastic. All right. And Josh, thank you again. And to our listeners, I'm Tony Grappone. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.